This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Joseph Remnant. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics.
And on this episode, I have a great conversation with Joseph Remnant. His new book, Cartoon Clouds, came out a couple of weeks ago from Fantagraphics. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse comics at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that go higher than that.
Some of those great discounts can be found when you check out the bundles that DCBS has every single month, including bundles of DC, Marvel, Valiant, and a variety of other titles that you can find at up to 50% off. And you can get bundles of Vertigo titles or the New Age of DC Heroes bundles or Marvel Legacy bundles, all kinds of bundles that you could take advantage of at Discount Comic Book Service.
That's right. And let's not forget, you can find Joseph Remnant's Cartoon Clouds at 30% off of the cover price at Discount Comic Book Service. In fact, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, do a search for Cartoon Clouds, you'll find that it's only $14.94. That's a great deal, but you can always find incredible deals at dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah, please let them know.
Paul, I had a really good time talking with Joseph Remnant the other day. Now, we primarily talked about his new book, one that came out just a couple of weeks ago through Fantagraphics, Cartoon Clouds. But we also talked about some of his other work as well. And in fact, Cartoon Clouds started off as being serialized online. He used to have a website with Noah Van Sciver. It's no longer there anymore, but that's where he originally started this comic. I knew him primarily, though, through his series Blind Spot, but even more so the illustrated work that he did for Harvey Pekar's Cleveland.
Yeah, I can't wait to read Cartoon Clouds. It looks phenomenal, and I'm excited to for us to share this conversation you had.
Yeah, and we had a good conversation. Let's go ahead and listen to it now. I have the pleasure of talking with Joseph Remnant. His new book, Cartoon Clouds, came out from Fantagraphics a couple of weeks ago. Joseph, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you about this new graphic novel. I don't know, do you like the term graphic novel, or do you just prefer comics?
I don't care.
Okay, you go either way.
I don't have strong feelings about it at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I think graphic novels a good way to distinguish for people who aren't familiar with comics, the comics world that we are. So it works.
Yeah, I agree. I don't necessarily like the term the way that most people use it, but I think in your case with Cartoon Clouds, it is rather appropriate in that this is, not a memoir, not an autobiography, not a work of history, but it comes across at least as a work of fiction. So, I mean, I'm okay calling it, I guess, a graphic novel. But this is something that you've been working on for a number of years, correct?
That's correct.
And you had serialized it in a website that you and Noah Van Sciver, a friend of yours, had maintained for a while, theexpositorcomics.com, right?
Yeah, we started this little website, and we were going to both serialize our books, and it quickly became apparent for me that was not the best way for me to work. But Noah does like 3 books a year. Yeah. And it takes me like 5 years to do a book. So the format didn't work so well for me. I'm more of a slow-paced worker,
So you were serializing what eventually became Cartoon Clouds. Was there anything else that you were working on this website in addition to Cartoon Clouds, or just Cartoon Clouds?
On that website, I think it was just Cartoon Clouds. I was doing a issue of Blind Spot around the same time, but Kilgore Books was putting that out. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was just like an idea we had as like a cheap move to try to get more attention for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And just one of those things. Noah was serializing his book Saint Cole.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And he's since come out with like another 5 books since then.
Yeah, that guy, God, he's damn prolific.
Yeah,
and
I think I put out the first 34 pages or so, and the book ended up being like 160. So at a certain point, I was like, this isn't, because I'd put like 10 pages on at a time, and then a few months would go by, and I'd put another 10 pages on. And I'm just like, this doesn't make sense. And I just disappeared for a few years to finish it that way.
So, I mean, did you consider it some form of a webcomic, or because you weren't on any kind of, I guess, set schedule? Yeah. But, I mean, did you think of it as a webcomic, or just a testing ground website?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the sense that it was a comic that was available to view on the web. But, I mean, I guess when I think of webcomic, I think more of like daily or at least weekly updated thing where, I don't know, maybe that's unfair to say, but I do tend to think of webcomics as in the way that daily strips in the newspaper were. It's more ephemeral kind of thing, whereas this for me was something that I really wanted to plan out and like have a carefully scripted thing that I saw through to the end. And I don't think that work really translates well to that medium so well, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great observation because and I haven't seen, I never saw that website, theexpositorcomics.com, and now it's no more, or at least when you put in theexpositorcomics.com, you get something, I think it's in Japanese.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I took it down about a year ago or so.
Yeah, so apparently someone else kind of gobbled it up, or some company, and that's what you'll find there. But when you had the site up, when you and Noah were contributing to that and putting your work up, did you allow web browsers who would come by to make comments on the various pages that you would put up?
I'm trying to think. I don't know that we did. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think we did.
And one of the reasons I'm asking is because it strikes me, now not all webcomic creators do this, but many of them, in fact, most of them I think do, they allow readers to make comments about their, either daily, weekly, or however frequently they come out with new installments, people to comment on what they thought of the page. And many times the creators will get into a dialogue with their fans to the point that I wonder how much of the story beyond that point is determined by whatever fans say and what seems to resonate with readers. In other words, with webcomic creators, what they can do is they can take the temperature, so to speak, of their readership and then tailor their narrative or their plot or characters accordingly. Now, I'm not suggesting that most webcomic creators do this, but I've seen some who seem to do that. And when you made the comment that you wanted to carefully plot out your story, that would seem to work against the kind of strategy that at least some web comic creators have, and that is, to create kind of community, to get a reaction, and then take their story from there.
Yeah, I think that can be dangerous. It's good to get some kind of feedback in some general sense, I think, but you can get some random comment from somebody, and it can really mess with your head about what you're doing, and it might not be relevant to really in a way. But I'm somebody who will get very sort of in my head about those types of things. Somebody makes a comment, and I start wondering what they meant by it, and I'll start thinking I need to completely change everything about the work, and so I think that works well for some people, but for me, I like to kind of create an isolation and not get too much input from people as I go.
Huh. So that's interesting. When you're, I guess, somewhat similarly, when you're working on a strip or an illustration of some sort, do you purposefully kind of take yourself out of certain media? In other words, do you refuse to read comics as you're in the middle of your own comic story?
That did just kind of happen naturally. I went through a period where I was reading a lot of comics, and then once I really got into this book, at a certain point, I didn't read hardly any comics for a couple of years. And I'm not sure, that wasn't necessarily because of that reason, but I think part of it is just you get older and you stop taking in as much of other people's art and kind of go deeper into your own thing, for whatever reason.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the specifics of this new book, Cartoon Clouds, which I guess technically is a work of fiction, but while reading it, I couldn't help but wonder if some of this, if not quite a bit, may be based, if not loosely based, on your own life experiences as an artist. Because this is a story about an artist, right? The protagonist, Seth, we see him right when he graduates from art school, and then the book deals with how is he going to be dealing with his life after school, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a job, trying to make sense of relationships. How closely did this align with your own lived experiences?
I mean, it's definitely a work of fiction. The story itself is pretty made up, but I definitely, I used a lot of my own experiences and people that I've known, and it's hard to kind of pick apart what is from my life or other people's lives that I know and what is fiction. I mean, I said it in Cincinnati where I went to art school. I definitely had that experience of graduating and feeling lost for several years. And, I feel like that time of life, early mid-20s is sort of glamorized in the media and everything, but it's really the worst time of life. It's just because you're still a kid essentially, but you're expected to lay the groundwork for the rest of your life at this point in time. And especially if you did something like something stupid like go to art school. And there's just, it's absurd. There's no options available really to you. You have to kind of accept that if you want to be an artist, it's just going to be a long slog of hard work for very little reward and no guarantee that anything's going to come of it, So to me, it's just, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so what your protagonist Seth goes through is, in some ways, I guess, maybe an amalgamation of not only your experiences, upon graduating from art school, but others that you've known who have been through the same thing.
Oh, yeah. Sure, because there's characters in the book that I use pieces of stories of people that I know or, ideas. It's definitely, it feels very personal. Like the character isn't me, but it feels like me in a way. Mm-hmm. It's his path, the relationship with the character Allison, that was all fictional, but for whatever, like that character feels like me in a way. I think most people that know me and read the book will sense that. And yeah, but you know, I don't want this to people to like read the back of the book and go, oh, I didn't go to art school. I'm not going to relate to this, because I wanted it to just be a sort of universal story that people can relate to. And I think people that have nothing to do with the art world at all will be able to enjoy the story, because ultimately I wanted it to be an entertaining story. Yeah,
and it's interesting because when I was reading this, I wondered how significant in this narrative is the fact that the protagonist is an artist, went to art school. I mean, how would the story be different if we see him graduated from college, but he has a completely different area of study, right? It could be sociology, It could be philosophy, or definitely not business. I think that's another deal there, which we do get in a variety of ways with the character Kat, right, who does have a background in business. But I think one of the things that you would lose in making Seth and his friend Jeff and, Allison a non-artist is that, do I want to call them your targets? I think, yeah, to some degree, you would lose a number of your targets, right? It's not that, at least for me as a reader, you're necessarily focusing on a specific individual or individuals, but types, right? So if Seth, Allison, Jeff, if they weren't artists, then this kind of ridiculous pretentiousness that we see in figures like, of course, Colby Davis, but even some of the students like Fryman and, how do you pronounce his name? Smurgle?
Smurgle, yeah.
Smurgle, yeah. Yeah, it sounds like a Hobbit character.
Yeah.
But, I mean, what you're doing is you're pointing out the, at times even idiocy of these personality types, posers, people assuming some kind of self-importance. And I don't think, at least, that you're being unfair by looking at types of that sort. But my point is, if Seth, Allison, Jeff, if they weren't artist figures, then you really couldn't do the same things that you actually do in this book.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily would have to be visual artists, but I can only assume that those types exist across different mediums and different, probably not just artists too. I think anybody who's worked in any job, there's different factions of people, or, anybody who went to high school knows that there's, high school is kind of like a microcosm of all that you end up, like, you think, I'm going to graduate from high school and then we're all going to become adults and everyone's going to be these, grown up, mature people. But really, I don't know. Do you feel this way? Like, you look what's going on in the world right now, and it just like feels like, oh, this just high school just keeps going. And I kind of feel like, yeah, this is based in art school, but this is sort of a universal thing where there's douchebags and people fighting for power and people, backstabbing people to get where they want to be, and pretentiousness and high-minded people and timid people. And, so I think I said it in art school because it's a world that I'm very familiar with, but I can only assume that these types of things go on in all types of fields.
Right. I think especially with other entertainment fields. So, I mean, you could substitute music school for art school, and I think the same thing would happen. Same thing with creative writing programs, right? I mean, I used to see that all the time in graduate school because, I mean, I wasn't in a creative writing program in grad school, but I was in a really large English department, and it was divided into different areas. There was literary studies, which I was a part of. There was rhetoric and composition. There was linguistics. And then there was creative writing. And it was always, and I know I'm stereotyping here, but it was always the creative writers who would seem to pose or to assume a particular knowledge or self-satisfaction. In other words, invariably, when I was in a literature class with a creative writing student, he or she would almost always preface their comments by, well, as a creative writer or as a poet, I see Huckleberry Finn as, and, it's like, why would that matter? Why are you prefacing your critical take by saying, as an artist or as a poet, I feel this? Does that give your opinion a little more weight? So what am I? And so one time I got really tired of hearing that, and immediately after, actually someone who was a friend of mine, unfortunately said, as a writer, this is how I interpret this passage. I said, well, as a literary critic, this is how I interpret the passage. Intentionally trying to sound pretentious, but I think I got my point across. But yeah, I think now in other fields like maybe business, it would be a different game, right? You'd have different character types, and the backbiting and the feeling of self-importance would be given a completely different spin.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a certain brand of ego that goes along with being an artist. Mm-hmm. I think part of that is the way that artists have been portrayed in pop culture and sort of elevated to some ridiculous, height. The whole like rock star thing hasn't helped, I don't think. But you watch any movie about an artist and it's kind of like this self-important, godlike figure. And so when you go to art school, it's all the people that graduated from high school and think that they're that person, Mm-hmm. And then they're all just put in one place at one time. So it's very ripe for comedy in a way.
Well, that reminds me.
There's a certain self-importance. You're definitely right about that. About first of all, thinking that you're going to be a great artist is a delusion of grandeur to begin with. Now, thinking that you're going to be a famous, successful artist, and people are going to write books about you, and because that's what everyone simultaneously thinks that that's going to be them and knows that it's not going to be them at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of internal conflict in comedy that happens out of that.
Well, speaking of that attitude and comedy, one of the things I did to prepare to talk with you today is I fished out my issue of Blind Spot number 3 in that very first story, LA Coffee Shop, where because Blind Spot, your pieces are more overtly autobiographical, where you play a character. So you're in this LA coffee shop, and this character of you looks around and is thinking about how ridiculous some of these other people who are in the coffee shop, who are doing the same thing as he is doing, and looking pretentious in one form or another, the way that they're dressed or the way that they're writing things down in their notebooks or what have you. And I mean, there's a lot of humor instilled in that short strip, especially at the very end.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, that's the coffee shop right down the street from me. So, you work in a coffee shop in LA, and it's just seemingly people that nobody has jobs apparently in LA, and they're all just sitting in coffee shops. I mean, I guess maybe they're writing on a Netflix show or something, but everyone's writing their screenplay. It sounds like an exaggeration, but literally you go to any coffee shop in Los Angeles and 80% of people are there working on some type of screenplay.
And in a coffee shop, ordering just the one cup of coffee, and that's it.
Yes, and sitting there for like 8 hours.
God, when I
you get a croissant.
Yeah, when I lived in New York, I worked in a cafe in Manhattan that was right around the corner from an acting studio. And on the one hand, having the acting students come into the cafe on a regular basis after classes, it got kind of lively and colorful in some ways. On the other hand, though, they would sit there, order one cup of coffee or one cup of tea, and stay there for 2 or 3 hours and occupy a table that, could be someone coming in where I can make a bigger tip on. So that pissed me off.
Sure.
Yeah. But that's from a waiter's point of view.
Oh, that's the right point of view.
Getting back to Cartoon Clouds, one of the things I really appreciated about this book is the fact that, I've called Seth your protagonist, and he is, but not everything that goes on in this story is centered on or around him. And then along with that, his is not the only point of view, or at least focalization, that we have going on. And I appreciate that. I think it would have been easy to have a story based, I guess with Seth as your protagonist, and have everything centered around him. In other words, anything that would go on outside of his awareness wouldn't be a part of your story. But there are a variety of instances in Cartoon Clouds where we're taken away from what Seth's doing at the moment and experiencing, and we're shown the world of either Allison or Jeff or some other character. And I like that because I don't know if I'd call Cartoon Clouds an ensemble narrative, but it does give it more of an ensemble feel. And I'll tell you who it reminded me of. It's the kind of stories that Alex Robinson seems to create, because with Box Office Poison, and more recently with our expanding universe, he deals with groups of characters and their relationship and how each of them is dealing with their lives and the relationship in one form or another. And I really do enjoy that. And in fact, your book Cartoon Clouds really hit multiple sweet spots for me, because I prefer fictional comics narrative to things like memoir and autobiography, history. Nothing wrong with those other genres. It's just I prefer fiction. Also, I really do like this approach where you focus on a group of people and not just one individual and how they're interacting. I don't like the term slice of life, but if that applies and describes what goes on in Cartoon Clouds, something a little more realistic, I prefer those kind of stories. Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy things like fantasy, science fiction, and other kind of genres, but sure. I really do prefer, I think, the true-to-life, more realistic, even some would say mundane type of storytelling. And so, that's when I saw Cartoon Clouds in my bookshop, I thought, okay, that's it. I've got to check this out, because I had known your work through Blind Spot, and then the book that you illustrated for Harvey P. Carr's Cleveland. But yeah, this is a great new find for me.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think when I first started the book, it was going to be all based on through the lens of the character Seth. And then at a certain point, I realized that I could fall into the danger of making like this one guy's point of view be the all-important point of view, which isn't the way that I felt about the story, Mm-hmm. So I started getting more interested in more of the side characters and thinking like, well, what is this person's perspective on this thing? Because if I just told it through Seth's eyes, it felt like it was going to be me saying, yeah, this is the way that I see things personally. People are automatically going to think that this character is me. This is the way I see things, and he's doing things the right way, and these other people don't know what they're doing. So I wanted to, break off and to say, well, what's Allison's perspective on this, or what's, and also to see the different routes of the way people sort of deal with life after art school or school in general. Because paths diverge quite abruptly and drastically at that point. So it was important for me to do that. And also I just like that flow of a story where you're in a scene with one character, and then you turn the page and suddenly you're in the middle of someone else's story. And it kind of leaves you can kind of leave a little cliffhanger on another person's story. And then you're like, oh, I'm in this person's story now. You read through that and you're kind of, wanting to kind of carries you along. You want to find out what happens to that other character, and all these strings that kind of tie together as you go. I think that was something I was interested in. And a lot of that's just from being influenced by a lot of like good TV shows, stuff like Mad Men or The Wire, the way they'll like end a scene and then it's sort of like every scene kind of ends on a little bit of a cliffhanger in a very mundane way. Mm-hmm. But then you pick up and you're in somebody else's story, and you kind of see the way these different people's behavior and attitudes affect the other characters. So yeah, and you're also trying to avoid too much of the navel gazing stuff, which I'll still get criticized for that anyways, but hopefully that helps a little bit.
Well, you're right. I mean, had you focused, or at least maybe focalized exclusively through the character Seth, then there are going to be readers out there who, may rightly or wrongly accuse you of navel gazing, right? Because you're writing about an artist figure, someone who is not only interested in art in the broadest sense, but even cartooning. And so, of course, they're going to say, well, he's writing about himself in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, it's a lot of, the criticism of the book so far, a lot of it's like, do we need another story about an artist and dealing with, what is going to, woe is me, what am I going to do with my life kind of thing. And, I get that criticism, but at the same time, it's kind of like saying, do we need another story about high school drama? Mm-hmm. And to me, it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe not. To me, the story doesn't matter that much. It's like, how is it a good version of that thing? Mm-hmm. And I've always enjoyed those types of stories, coming of age things, if they're done well. They can be horrible, and you run the risk of getting into cheesy territory or, just cliche stuff. But when they're done well, I think those are really my favorite stories. So I wanted to do my own version of that.
Yeah. It's interesting. And also I find it ironic that you've gotten some of the criticism that you had mentioned, right? Like, do we need another, artist coming of age, trying to find himself kind of narrative? See, I would think that this kind of writing, the more slice of life, again, if we want to call it that, realistic, fictional narrative, is more a rarity than the standard. Now, if you had written a memoir or something that was more overtly autobiographical, then people could say, do we need another memoir or autobiography of an artist figure trying to find out what to do with himself, or recapturing or retelling the story of what it was like when he graduated from art school? That would have been a little more understandable, because you can't go anywhere in the field of comics now without a memoir or an autobiography of some sort. And again, there's no criticism. It's just that there's so many of them out there, and that's how many people even begin and continue to sustain their career in comics. But I think the fictional narrative, the kind that you've written with Cartoon Clouds, is more the exception now than the rule. At least that's from my reading experience.
Yeah, I think that's probably, in the 90s, it was probably the other way around, maybe, at least in the small world of alt comics mm-hmm. that I exist in. But yeah, now, I mean, the comics has become such a wide breadth of different types of people coming into comics, which I think is a good thing. So mm-hmm. there is no centralized thing anymore that people do. And like, you go to SPX or any of these shows now, and it's just a whole vast spectrum of different types of work. Some that just have nothing to do with each other at all, Mm-hmm. Whereas before, it definitely felt very much like, this is alt comics, and these people tell real personal stories about their lives, and then there's fantasy and that type of comics. It was a very kind of clear distinction, and now those genres have been kind of blended a lot. There's, interesting artists that are doing fantasy work now, and it's not such a cut and dry thing. Mm-hmm. I don't remember what the original question was, but
yeah. Something you said earlier, you were mentioning, I guess, the somewhat ensemble nature of Cartoon Clouds. And I think you put it this way, you can turn the page and you're in someone else's life. And you're right, in some instances that is the case, literally, where you turn a page of your book, and instead of Seth, we get something going on with Jeff, or what's Allison doing, what have you. But one of the things I noticed about your book is that not only when you turn the page, but sometimes in the middle of a page, you will have a shift of perspective from one character to another, which again is a little unusual because more times than not, comics artists will use the page and the turning of the page as a breaking point. And not only in terms of character perspective, but also in terms of time. I was interested, and pleasantly so, in the fact that there are a number of instances in Cartoon Clouds where in the middle of a page, let's say you have a, 8 to 9 panel grid on a page, but in the middle of the page, you have a shift in time of a number of weeks or months or what have you. And in other words, there's a significant lapse between what we saw in the first 2 or 3 panels and then what we see in the last 4 or 5. And that's something that's a little unusual. Again, it seems to me artists usually use the turning of the page as this either character perspective or temporal breaking point. But you were, I guess, brave enough, if we want to say that, to put those breaking points in the middle of a page.
Yeah, I think part of that, as the book goes, there's less of that. Mm-hmm. And part of that was me kind of figuring out how to pace it out. So I think part of that was just inexperience. To me, I think the way to do it is to turn the page and you've jumped time or you're in a different environment. But I also don't necessarily feel like I need to hold tight to that rule. This is one of those things where I'm like, do I need to have the next scene start on the next page? And I'd go through like a bunch of comics that I like, and I'd be like, Adrian Tomina starts a new scene in the middle of the page, so I can do it too, or whatever. So yeah. I don't know. What do you think that it works better when you flip the page, or does it matter to you? What do you think?
Well, one of the reasons why I noticed this, and I'm commenting on it, is I liked it in Cartoon Clouds because it was different. It's something that I didn't expect. Yeah. I do think that for, I guess, most reading experiences, the turning of the page is the logical breaking point, again, when it comes to either character perspective, time, or what have you, setting. But I don't know. There's something about doing the unexpected that I really appreciate. And so, as you mentioned early on, you did more of this than later in the book. It's something that I noticed. And I'm wondering if you did this early on more than you did later in Cartoon Clouds, was the structuring of the story, panel by panel or on a particular page, was early in this book, was that affected by the fact that maybe it was published online? Did that make a difference in how you paced things?
No, I don't think it was that I published it online. I think it was more that I didn't really know where I was going in the beginning. I kind of started the book with a very loose idea of what I wanted it to be. And I think that the first, 30 to 40 pages are a bit more of just sort of a rambling unfolding of a story. You'll notice it all takes place within like 2 days, like the first 30 or so pages. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly after that, at a certain point I said, all right, I need to know where I'm going. I need to know how this ends before I keep going, or else I'm going to get into trouble. Like I'm going to write a scene that doesn't make sense. So at a certain point, I had a sort of vague outline, but around 30, 40 pages, I really got serious about scripting it all out. So I at least knew the beats of where it was going, and I allowed myself to play with it as I went. But that allowed me to sort of break things down into pieces that made sense with the pacing of the story and how things were going to turn out for each character. Whereas in the beginning, it was more of okay, I kind of have a general idea what the scene is. Let me write out a few pages and then draw them. And then let me do that again, and then do that again. And then at a certain point, I wanted to make sure that I knew where this was going. And that allowed me to sort of break it into pieces that I personally think the book gets better at that point.
So from the way that you're describing it, it sounds as if you started to get more of a direction in that you felt the story got better around the time that you quit serializing it on your and Noah's theexpositorcomics.com website. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think it is.
So do you think that there was
paced better? I think it's paced better. I think scenes got tighter. There's scenes in the beginning of the book that are, 10 pages long. And at a certain point, I started to try and really break things down into the essential bits that I thought needed to be there. And so scenes started to become more, 3 or 4 pages each. And they're fairly consistently that way for the rest of the book. I think that works. I think the flow of the book works better. But I don't know. Some people might actually like the early part of the book better. I don't know.
Well, do you think that there's something? Do you think that there's something to not exposing your story online on that website? In other words, holding on to it to where you could really work with it longer, tighten things up, that makes it, at least the last half or the 2/3 of the book, quite a bit stronger.
Nah, I think it's more to do with. Well, it might subconsciously have something to do with it. I don't want to make too much of it being something that I was posting online, because to me it was just getting more experience. To draw 30 pages of comics for me is a year-long process. Mm-hmm. So you learn a lot in that time, and. I think it's dangerous to script out a whole story in advance, because then you feel it kind of gets stuck and you kind of know where everything's going, and then you're bored, and then you just have this long, laborious process of illustrating what you've already written. Mm-hmm. So when I started the book, it was like, all right, I just need to start something. So I wrote out a rough outline of a vague idea I had, and then I started drawing it. And you kind of go through that, and as you go through that, as you're going through the long hours of drawing, ideas occur to you, you write them down, and then at a certain point you start, it starts to form in your brain, like what this story is, what it's about, and then you can kind of go through that process of forming out the structure of what the story is. But I like to start. I mean, I'm going through this now because I'm trying to do a new book, and it's like, it's hard to start something when you don't know where it's going to go, because you're like, well, is this going to make sense in the end? But I think it's better to just start it, because you don't need to know what it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You start it, and then you figure out what it's going to be.
What you're saying now, and then your earlier comments about, feeling that this narrative gets better toward the end, has got me to thinking that, and I don't want to give away any spoilers for what goes on in Cartoon Clouds, but thinking about this now, given what you just said, I mean, all of this makes sense. There are some key moments in the final, quarter, fifth of the book that are really nicely scripted parts of the plot. And in fact, there's one key moment, and again, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but it does involve someone that Seth is very admiring of, another artist figure. But there's a particular event that occurs toward the very end that I think I didn't expect. I honestly didn't. But after I read this scene, it takes place in a bar, it struck me as that, of course, this had to have happened, or at least something like that. It didn't seem predictable. And by the way, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, until I finished that scene and thought, but of course, everything in some ways, you could argue, kind of led to that moment. But I didn't think about that until I actually got to that scene and finished it. And I said, oh, okay, of course. And then another really nice touch at the end, and again, part of what makes this book hit a number of sweet spots for me. I love ambiguous endings. I mean, I hate stories, works of fiction, or even nonfiction that are tied up really neatly and even predictably. I much prefer a narrative that ends with a question mark, either a big or a small one, but nonetheless a question mark. And I think Cartoon Clouds does end with a question mark. I guess you could make the argument that there's something like a positive ending at the end, but even then, I think you could make the argument we don't know what ultimately happens. And I think ambiguity, even in a major scene toward the end where Seth is talking with Allison and we cannot hear what they say to each other. In other words, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like if we're not inside, it looks like we're inside of the car that he's about to get into, and we're seeing him and Allison have a conversation from the inside of the car, and as such, we can't hear what they're saying. Is that the case? Is the visual perspective from inside the car?
Well, it was, he opens the door and goes to talk to her. And
so
then
it's that door that's open.
Yeah, we're seeing the conversation through the open door.
Ah, that's right. Yeah, you're right. Because there is the one panel where he opens the door, gets out, and we see the open door as he's walking toward Allison.
But behind the glass, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's kind of obscured because it's a snowy scene and there's tons of snow falling, and it's yeah. But I like the idea. I didn't want to. Well, I don't know if I want to give too much of that away, but yeah, just not hearing what they were. I didn't feel like we needed to hear what they were saying at that point.
Right. Yeah.
We've already heard them hash it out in a way,
Yeah.
So I thought it would just been overkill to have them have another heartfelt conversation or whatever at that point. And you can kind of determine on your own what's going on there.
Right. And then in the final pages, we get kind of underscored something that you had mentioned, right? The different trajectories that the various friends' lives seem to take after art school. Because we do see some final scenes with Seth, but we also see some with Jeff and then with Allison. And each of these lives, Jeff, Allison's, and Seth's, seem quite different.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's, but again, ambiguous. And so I think that's a, very effective way of ending your graphic novel.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because when you're in something that holds you together, like art school, you all kind of feel like you're all on the same path, and you're all there. You're all doing the same thing. We're all making paintings, and we're all heading in the same great direction. And then that doesn't end up being true at all. Yeah. And there might be somebody who's like really good in art school, and then 10 years later you check in on what they're doing on Facebook, and they're like, oh, I work at this firm as a accountant. I don't know what people do for jobs. Something.
They're waiting in an LA coffee shop.
Yeah, whatever it is. It's just something completely out of left field, and that's just what happens. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just what you have to do sometimes.
We should also mention and maybe even talk a bit about another book that you illustrated that came out I think back in August, or at least it's a new edition of the book, and that's Harvey P. Carr's Cleveland. This originally came out in 2012, co-published by Zip Comics and then Top Shelf, and that's the edition that I originally got. But I guess a new Top Shelf edition came out in August. Is this newer edition, for all practical purposes, the exact same as the 2012 edition?
As far as I know, yeah. I mean, well, it's some of the production stuff is a little different, but the story is the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now this came out originally, roughly not quite 2 years after Harvey P. Carr passed. How much had you been working on this book with him before he died?
I think I did about 30 pages or so, and I had worked with him before on short stories. Mm-hmm. So I'd been working with him for a couple of years, and then I had got this script from him and did about 30 pages when he died. But it was, I wasn't working closely with him. He sent me a script and would call me occasionally at 6 a.m. For what by the time I started working with Harvey, he was, getting up in years and kind of forgetful about a lot of things. Half the time I don't think he knew that I remembered that I lived on the West Coast, so he would frequently call me at 6 a.m. And I would just, answer it gladly. Hey, Harvey, how's it going? So that was kind of my relationship with Harvey. It was occasionally getting random freak out calls from him.
Freak out calls?
Remembering if he sent me something or, Harvey Picard calls.
Yeah.
He is that guy.
Yeah.
Just looking at your phone at 6 a.m. and it says Harvey Picard, and you're like, oh fuck! All right, here we go. Hey, Joseph, that was that guy. It wasn't a character.
So that's how he would start off the conversation.
Yes.
Well, I would guess then, from what you just said, that working with him on this book from a distance, there wasn't that much transition you had to do in terms of finishing up the book after he died then. Yeah,
the script was complete, at least in some form. Mm-hmm. It may, there were little things that I would send him, I'd finish 10 pages and send them to him, and he would have a note or two. And so that would have continued to happen throughout the rest of the book, which obviously didn't end up happening. And there was probably some things in the book that could have been better if he was alive, I think. Mm. But then there was also a certain aspect of, I felt like I was able to insert myself a little more into it in a way.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't necessarily thinking is Harvey going to be okay with me? Kind of breaking this, sometimes Harvey would have a giant stretch of text in a thing, and I'd be like, I'm going to break this into 3 or 4 panels or whatever. I think I probably felt more comfortable doing that when I knew I wasn't going to be sending it to Harvey and getting his response to it. And he probably would have been fine with it, actually. But I felt a little more free to do those types of things. And there was things like, the beginning and the ending of the book that I added all these just shots of Cleveland to kind of introduce it and then end it, kind of have a more dramatic ending. So yeah, I don't know. It's definitely a collaboration.
Did you get much, if any, input from his widow, Joyce Brabner, after Harvey passed?
No, she was really happy with it. She didn't try to micromanage me in any way. She would just, I think she was going through a tough time too. So she wasn't really into, dealing with some artists on the West Coast so much. I have a good relationship with Joyce, and I think she felt that I did justice to that work, that being kind of his final big work too,
Yeah.
I think she was happy that because I really put a lot of, I think a lot of PCAR artists treated that work as, this is a work for hire job. Let me knock this out tonight real quick between my other work. And to me, it was this is my first, I was still a young guy. This is first shot. I was a fan of Harvey. So I was I'm going to put everything I have into doing this. So yeah, I think it was, and I look at it now and like any artist, you don't like your old work. So I have trouble looking at it now, but at the time I definitely put everything I had into it. So,
you've got a very,
I think she appreciated that.
Yeah. And you have a very intricate, detailed style. Yeah, and you can see this not only in P-Cars Cleveland, this earlier work, but also in the most recent Cartoon Clouds, where there's a lot of shading, there's quite a bit of cross-hatching, a lot of shadows. And so something like this, Harvey P-Cars Cleveland, I mean, you couldn't just knock out over a short period of time, given your style of illustration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, how did you become associated with P-Car? When did you what happened to where you first started to illustrate for him?
I was working with this magazine, Arthur Magazine. You remember Arthur?
Oh God,
by Jay Babcock.
I vaguely remember now that, or recall now that you mentioned that.
Yeah, it was like a free magazine. Part political, part music and culture. Mm-hmm. But they had a comic section. Alvin Buenaventura, before he was doing The Believer, was running that section of comics in Arthur. But Jay I remember just posting something on his MySpace page, like a drawing, and then he just wrote to me and was like, "Hey, you want to I like your drawings? You want to do illustrations for Arthur?" And that was the first person that ever offered me any publishing work. And I did this comic about, remember the book Rebel Visions by Patrick Rosencrantz?
Oh yeah, that collection of
underground comics.
Yeah.
Fantagraphics had put out a reissue of that, and I did, and he asked me to do like a comic strip review of it. So I did this 3-page sprawling review of that book, and I got some attention from some of the underground cartoonists that I was talking about it. And then this cartoonist Jay Lynch, who passed away recently. Mm-hmm. Somehow he got my number. I don't know how, but he just called me one day because he liked that comic. And I talked to him for a little bit, and somehow we ended up talking about Harvey P-Card. He's like, "Would you ever want to work for Harvey P-Card?" And I was like, "Sure, yeah, I guess." And he's like, "All right, I'm going to send Harvey your work." And 2 weeks later, I got a call from Harvey. So that's how that happened, yeah. And then we did some short stories stuff together, and he liked those. And then when that book happened, he just offered it to me.
How does it feel following in the shoes of Robert Crumb?
I don't know. Yeah, there's been many artists that work for P-Card too. So right. I'm also.
Yeah, but the most prominent of which is Arthur Crumb. Yeah,
I mean, to me, those are the great. Mm-hmm. To me, the great P-Card is the collaboration between P-Card and Crumb.
Right.
Those are still some of my favorite comics ever. Mm. The comic about collecting records, or his record collecting addiction, or the young Crumb story. Those things are just so, I don't know, there's something about them.
Well, let's talk about something that we referenced early on, and that is your comic book series Blind Spot. Now, the last issue came out in 2013?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, Blind Spot number 3. Is this something that you plan on returning to, or have you more or less set aside indefinitely this series?
I might do it again. I don't know. I'm trying to kind of figure out what to do. I'm definitely doing more short stories now, but I don't know that that's the best way to publish them. I've got a story that's going to be in the next issue of Now that Eric Reynolds is editing.
Oh, in issue number 2?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So I'm kind of thinking, if I do a short story, it's kind of better to maybe submit it to that, or I don't know. I also have, it's just this day and age. It's hard to know if that's the best way to do it, because I could get short stories in anthologies, and probably another 1,000 people will see it, as if I publish it myself or go through a small publisher or whatever. But I don't know. I might do it. Right now, I'm just kind of working on shorts. I want to do a book of a collection of short stories, so I don't know what form it's going to take yet. Still figuring it out.
I was asking about Blind Spot because I have a particular fondness for Kilgore books and comics, and
Yes.
Dan's a great guy, and it'd be great to see another issue of Blind Spot come out through Kilgore. But this is great to hear about you having a story in issue number 2 of Now. And in fact, we just recently, I think about 2-3 weeks ago, on one of the Comics Alternatives weekly review shows, looked at Now number 1. And my co-host Paul and I both loved it. We loved the collection. And we were reminiscing about several years ago when Fantagraphics put out Mome, which I dearly missed when they discontinued that. So now that Eric has come out with Now, this other anthology, I'm hoping that this will take the place in my reading heart where Mome had been.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think it's great because there's not a lot of everyone can put stuff online, and there's a lot. It's all kind of factioned out now,
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a sense in comics where people make short stories, and it's like, oh, this is just my lesser work before I make a graphic novel. But comics almost work better in short story form, in some ways. So it's kind of absurd that we've reached this point where it's like everyone has to make a great graphic novel.
Mm-hmm.
No, you don't. You can make an 8-page story can be as good as a graphic novel, and sometimes better. Because there's something about comics, the way that they're broken into panels, that it kind of works for that short story and format, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way time lapses between panels, you can say a lot in a short period of time. Because and in the same way with film, I guess you cut to another scene, but it's not in the same fluid way where it's very much in comics you're breaking things down. So like I had this 1-page comic about Buddy Holly, and it's basically like a span of 10 years in 6 panels. And it's one of my favorite comics I've ever done. And you could only do that in comics, I think.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me, you're talking about the short story form or the shorter form comic story. One of the things that I have a particular fondness for is something like a short story cycle in comics. I call it a graphic cycle, where you have a collection of stories that each could stand on its own by itself and still be complete and whole, right? So you read one of those stories and you don't feel that you're missing out on anything else that may be referenced or mentioned in passing or what have you. But you take all of those stories together, and there's some kind of binding tissue of some sort. It could be the setting, right? Like Winesburg, Ohio, where all of those stories are, Sherwood Anderson's, they're set in the same location. Or it could be a particular character is present in each of the stories. Or, arguably it could even be thematically based. I think that's a little weaker for a cycle narrative. But I really do enjoy those kind of collections. A great example of that, I think, is Will Eisner's Contract with God, which, people mistakenly consider the first graphic novel. It wasn't. But even calling it a graphic novel is a misnomer because it's 4 short stories.
Yeah.
However, one of the things about that collection of 4 stories is they all take place on the same city block, Dropsy Avenue. And they're interconnected in a variety of different ways. And so it's very much like what you would call in fiction a composite novel or a short story cycle. I really like those kind of collections by a single author. I like anthologies as well, where you have contributions from a variety of different creators, such as Now. But but I like the collection of short comic stories that are maybe even loosely interconnected in some way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's something that can be done very well in comics that I don't think a lot of people think about or do. I think like the last issue of Blammo was like that in a way. Blind Spot 3, I tried to do that as well, where it's like 4 short stories, but there's sort of a thematic weight that sort of intertwines, and there's pacing to the structure of that comic that I tried to make it feel like all part of one thing, even though it's 4 separate stories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there's other people doing it too that I just don't know of, but yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I was thinking about that second story in issue number 3 of Blind Spot, Pappy Ron's Pizza. Yeah. Not a fan of Papa John, by the way.
Yeah, not a great guy, I don't think.
Yeah, both the pizza and also, I guess, the persona and even the politics behind it.
Yeah, I remember he was like arguing about when Mitt Romney was running for president. He was saying like he was going to have to raise the cost of his pizza by 4 cents if he was going to have to be forced to give his employees health insurance.
Is that what inspired that short comic in Blind Spot number 3?
Yeah, that was sort of the initial thing that I was riffing on.
Yeah.
It was like the most absurd argument against giving people health care. And if I have to give people health care, I'm going to have to raise the price on my pizza by 4 cents or whatever. That's going to be passed on to you guys.
Yeah. I think that's about the time that I absolutely quit even considering Papa John's as an option for pizza ordering.
Yeah. It's not good.
Well, Joseph, you mentioned earlier, I guess kind of in passing, that you were working on something right now. Is this anything that you can talk about or feel like talking about and sharing, or are you the kind of a creator who doesn't really want to talk about what you're doing until you're done?
Yeah, I mean, can't say too much about it because it's still very fluid. I don't know what it's going to be. So if I say something about it now, it's likely to completely change, or I might abandon it and then I'll just look like an idiot later. But I am doing more watercolor. Like the style is color, and it's watercolor and ink all on one page. And I did some of these comics for The Believer in this style. And the story I have in now is like that. And that's one of the reasons too where I'm not sure that I want to do another issue of Blind Spot, because I want the production value to be high on this, because in order to get it to look like the originals, it's going to have to be done right with like really nice paper and color. So I don't know if Kilgore would want to do that, or and even Fantagraphics, they don't really put out comics anymore in the sense of, oh, here's a 30-page comic or whatever. So I don't know how I'm doing it, but that I am working in that style, and kind of like you were just saying, a collection of short stories that all kind of tie together thematically. And in the same way as Cartoon Clouds kind of became more of an ensemble thing, I'm working in that format where I'm kind of following different characters, but they're more detached from each other. And then you kind of see them the way that they connect later on. But it's all very fluid at this point. So I don't know. It could all change. But I like playing with that idea, like having one city that it all takes place in. And then we sort of pick up on these seemingly completely different stories that have nothing to do with each other. And then eventually you kind of see how they connect. So I'm trying to play with that. And again, it's kind of like Cartoon Clouds. It's people later in life, mostly artist types, or one of the characters is a musician and one's a rock critic and a painter, and following the trajectories of these different characters and then kind of seeing how they intertwine. That's the vague idea that I could talk about at this point. Okay.
So at the same time that you're working on, let's say, maybe, perhaps, in a fluid way, this series of shorter comics, do you see yourself doing more for anthologies like Now?
Yeah, that's kind of, what I'm thinking right now is finish doing short stories, at least submitting them to something like Now, The problem is, it comes out every 4 months, and there might not be a space for it at that time, and then I might have to just say, oh, well, I'm just going to do this as a book by myself.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to disappear for another 5 years with nothing. So I don't know. I might, I've thought about, I might hit up Dan and say, hey, you want to put up a bunch of money for this thing? And Dan's so nice that he'll probably do it, even though it's a bad idea for him to do it. But, yeah.
Well, he's recently been using Kickstarter to help finance some of the books that he comes out with. You can use that as an argument. It's like, hey, Dan, I know this may cost a bit, but hey, Kickstarter.
Yeah, it's true. I don't want any part in that, but if he wants to do it, then that seems like my worst nightmare is starting a Kickstarter.
Oh God, and having to manage that.
Oh, I would worry too that like nobody would contribute, and then it would just be this giant embarrassment. That's what stops me from doing it.
Yeah, I've never kickstarted anything, although we do have a Patreon account for the Comics Alternative that has fluctuated over the years. So there are times that we've had a lot of people backing us for substantive, like, more than $1 is what I consider substantive amounts. Although, $1 supporters, hey, that's great as well. We have a lot of those. But other times where we don't have as many because people backed us for a while, then they didn't. Maybe they'll come back for a short period of time. So, but it's different than Kickstarter, right? Because with Kickstarter, there's an endpoint. At least with Patreon, if you're down, you think, okay, but this is for the long run, so I may be up later.
Yeah.
Right? It's like that old Sinatra song, That's Life, where you're, up in April, shot down in May. But yeah,
I think Patreon's great, actually. It's and kind of necessary, too, because, that seems to be the way the economy's going, is everyone's got to kind of do their own thing. There's not these giant companies that are just funding whole cities anymore,
Yeah. And you don't have a Patreon account, do you?
I don't. No.
Yes, because I was going to say I didn't see it on your website, which we should mention, and I'll put this in the show notes as well. But for our listeners, if they want to find out more about your work, they can go to your website, josephremnant.net, and that's one word, Joseph Remnant, and then .net. And so you have examples of some of the comics you've done, your drawings and paintings, contact information, and info about who you are.
Yeah, and I would suggest people follow me on Instagram. To get the most, that's probably the thing that I'm most active on as far as posted. If you want to see like drawings in progress or things like that, and then and Facebook or whatever. But yeah.
It's interesting because I know you have a Tumblr account, but it seems that more people now are using Instagram over Tumblr in terms of getting their visual arts now.
Me. It's weird, like I would post stuff on Tumblr and get like 3 likes or whatever they call them on Tumblr, and then I'll post it on Instagram and get like 150.
Yeah. So
for whatever reason, Instagram seems to work for me, and now I just post something on Instagram and send it over to Tumblr, and maybe people follow me there. I don't know. I don't ever go there anymore. Which I think has been a lot of people's experience with Tumblr. But I was talking to Simon Hanselman about this. And he was like king of Tumblr for a while, and he was like, yeah, it's dead. There's no reason to be on Tumblr anymore. He's mainly focusing on Instagram as well now, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. When before I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where I am now, I was living in the greater Dallas area, and I was teaching at UT Dallas, and I was teaching in the Arts, Technology, and Emerging Communication program. So I taught a number of courses dealing with digital media, both writing for it and also critiquing it, looking at it from a critical angle. And I could gauge from my students what social media platforms were kind of hot or hip at any particular semester, and which ones were passé. And yeah, Tumblr is one of those that seemed to be, at least with my students, passé for a while. Things like Instagram and especially Snapchat is where they seem to be gravitating.
Yeah. Well, I think Instagram right now for me is a nice break from politics because people don't post political stuff on Instagram, at least not in the same way they do on every other media platform. Twitter, I find completely unbearable at this point. And Facebook, kind of the same way. But I can go to Instagram and just see people's drawings and pictures. And if I want to go read the news, then I'll go to some news site that I actually trust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's my experience with Instagram and other social media platforms as well. I mean, I use a variety of them, but I have to admit that I primarily use them for promotion of the podcast. I know that that's not the best way to use them.
Yeah.
Because in order to build an audience and definitely build community, not only using social media platforms to promote, but also to communicate with, right? And I just don't have the time to fully utilize Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, I mean, all of them. But with Instagram, one of the things I can fairly easily do is to go through my feed and see what a variety of creators are doing. In other words, I don't have to sift through too much chaff in order to get to the good wheat stuff. And so I like that. I mean, that's how I found out, for instance, recently, I guess this past year or so, that Rich Tommaso was working on something that eventually became Spy Seal. It's just seeing the art that he puts up there.
Right.
And so there are a lot of artists like that I can see what they're working on, and then several months down the road, I recognize that, or at least an early draft of it. And I appreciate that in ways that I don't have the same experience with Twitter or even Facebook, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, that's how I use Twitter now too. It's like, if I'm going to do an event or something, post it there. If I'm going to, the one thing the reason I keep Twitter is there's always that off chance that somebody with 500,000 followers will retweet something, and then suddenly you've got a whole new audience. Mm-hmm. There is that potential on Twitter, which is interesting. So it's good for that. But as far every time I go on there and start scrolling through, I just filled with rage. You know what I mean? It's gotten so absurd. Yeah.
Yeah, you become frustrated and curmudgeon-y like Harvey Pekar.
Yeah, it's not healthy.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, I want to thank you for taking the time and talking with me on the Comics Alternative about not only your new book, Cartoon Clouds, but also other things as well, Blind Spot, your work with Pekar, and social media and other matters.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So good luck with your new work. I hope to see it soon, and I definitely look forward to your story in the second issue of Now.
All right, great. Appreciate it.
So there you have it, Paul, my conversation with Joseph Remnant. We talked primarily about Cartoon Clouds, but we also talked about other things like his work with Harvey Pekar, what it was like to work with Harvey, and it was just a good time talking with Joseph.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I mean, sometimes your interviews feature creators that I know really well, and other times less well, and this was the latter for me, but I'm really glad that I got to listen in, and again, I'm looking really forward to reading Cartoon Clouds. Mm-hmm. So thanks for featuring this interview, Derek.
Sure, and as I told Joseph, this book, Cartoon Clouds, really does hit a lot of sweet spots for me. It's a work of fiction. It's not necessarily autobiographical, even though it may have some of those elements. You're dealing with, in some ways, kind of an ensemble cast. I really do like works like this, and this may be one of my favorites of 2017.
Yeah, it looks and sounds by your conversation to be something I definitely am going to read.
Yeah, definitely check it out, and I recommend that our listeners do as well. And in fact, you can get a copy of Cartoon Clouds at 35% off of the cover price for only $14.94 at our sponsor's website, Discount Comic Book Service. Remember, go to dcbservice.com. You'll find a lot of specials, not only for Joseph's new book, but for other comics as well. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about my conversation with Joseph Remnant. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
We're always available by email at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. Derek is derek@comicsalternative.com. If you want to reach out to me for whatever reason, I'm paul@comicsalternative.com. But we always love your feedback, as well as you sharing about interviews like the one that we had today through social media.
That's right. And we're all over social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and now Slack. Please come join our Slack channel. Be a part of that community.
That's right.
That's right. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the various reviews and commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. And we have more interviews lined up in the weeks to come, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul.
We'll be back soon.